Welcome to the Audio Inc. Radio podcast, featuring interviews with the biggest names in rock and metal. Hosted by Anne Erickson.
Get inked. Visit Facebook.com/Audio Inc. Radio, Twitter.com/Audio Inc. Radio, and AudioIncRadio.com for more ink. Whew, that's a lot of ink. It's AudioIncRadio.com.
I've always been fascinated with the era of music history in the early 90s when grunge just took over mainstream music because, I mean, it was so different than what was going on in Hollywood and stuff like that in the 80s with the quote-unquote hair metal scene. It was just so different. It was almost just a total juxtaposition to everything that popular music was in the 80s. And then from all the research that I've done, because I've done different features and stories and stuff like that about this era of music history, from all the research that I've done, it seems like it was almost overnight that one day these hair metal bands were performing to thousands of people in arenas and selling out shows, and then bam, the next day it was done. It was over. I even read actually that at some of these shows they actually had cutouts of people in the audience to kind of help it look more packed or something like that, which is really weird. But I'm just so fascinated with how organic the whole Seattle scene was in the late 80s and the early 90s, and how Nirvana just became so mainstream. And then Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, all those bands. I mean, you actually look at a record like Pearl Jam 10, and that came out before Nevermind, but you would never know because it wasn't until after Nevermind that people started to dig into this music and want to hear more about the Seattle scene. And I also think that based on all of the different musicians who I've interviewed in the Seattle scene, Jerry Cantrell and just a bunch of different ones, there was somewhat a surprise that grunge, or quote unquote grunge, whatever you want to call it, went mainstream. There was a thought that, okay, this could be kind of big. It could be maybe a Sonic Youth big, but it was so much bigger. And that's why I've just always really loved to read up on not just the Seattle scene, but also the 80s metal, rock, Los Angeles, Hollywood type scene, because those things are intertwined. It's just weird because it was almost like the Seattle grunge was a reaction to that quote unquote hair metal, which had gotten so over the top and very much about image at that point. And then here's Kurt Cobain with long hair and flannel singing nonsensical stuff with guitars that were, I don't want to say easy, but simple guitar is just a raw emotion, and people just really took to that raw emotion. The very beginning of that Seattle scene had bands that probably a lot of people haven't heard of. One of those bands was The Living, which these guys were really cool. Duff McKagan was actually a member of The Living back when he was just a teenager, and they had a very cool punk type sound. And really crazy to think, but their debut record was never released. Ever. I mean, how often does that happen? They put out this debut record and never had a proper release until now, because Loosegroove Records, which is headed up by Stone Gossard of Pearl Jam and Reagan Hagar from Brad and some other people involved, but they're going to put out The Living 1982, that record, on April 16th, which is very exciting. And I've heard the whole thing. It sounds very organic, and the quality of the sound quality is so good. You would never think that something recorded back in the early 80s would have a similar sound quality to now, but wow, this stuff sounds really good. So it's very exciting that finally they're going to get a home for The Living 1982. And Duff McKagan, I think a lot of people think of him just, of course, in Guns N' Roses, and kind of think of Guns N' Roses as the antithesis to that Seattle sound, especially when you think about how Axl kind of had a beef with Kurt Cobain and stuff like that. But you don't think that Duff, he was actually a Seattle guy. I mean, he was big in the Seattle scene very early on and a big punk influence. He is so cool too. I feel like when I see Duff McKagan, anytime I see him interviewed or whatever performing, he just is super cool. Just a cool dude. But Pearl Jam is a band that I have really grown to appreciate. I saw them for the first time in concert several years ago at this point at Joe Louis Arena, rest in peace, great venue in Detroit. And people were coming from all over to see Pearl Jam. It was really cool. And I mean, in line, I met people from across the world who just flocked to as many Pearl Jam gigs as possible. And fun story, Pearl Jam 20 is my favorite movie or documentary, kind of my favorite movie. I don't know if you're allowed to have a documentary as your favorite movie, but if you are, my favorite is Pearl Jam 20. It goes in depth about not just Pearl Jam, but the whole Seattle scene, starting with Mother Love Bone. And it's just a great historical look at everything that happened in Seattle and in popular music and culture around the time of the genesis of this kind of music. And it also goes up to almost today. I mean, it's been out for a while now, so it doesn't go up to the current Pearl Jam, but it discusses their battle with Ticketmaster and stuff like that. So it goes up into more of the current stuff. But it's a great documentary, and if you haven't seen it yet, you have to check it out. In fact, it's funny. My mom has teased me about the fact that I've made everyone in my life watch this documentary. I made my mom watch it. I made my dad watch it. He doesn't even know who any of these bands are, but I made him watch it, and he really loved it from a historical standpoint. And pretty much any guy I've ever dated, I've made watch this documentary. So just saying, it's a great one, and very excited and honored to have the legendary Stone Gossard of Pearl Jam on the show. We're going to talk about the living 1982 and why he wanted to put this music out there. Why did he feel like it was so important for Loosegroove Records, for his label, to release this music? And what does this music say about that period in music history? What does it mean? What kind of a snapshot does it leave? And we'll talk a little bit about Pearl Jam and about his memories from kind of growing up in that scene and kind of being at the genesis of that musical movement, which is one of the biggest musical movements out there. I can't even think of many other huge kind of music trends since grunge. I kind of feel like nu metal, maybe. I mean, that was a pretty big deal when nu metal came out. That was a big deal, but it wasn't. I mean, a lot of the bands were in California, but it wasn't as centric to a locale as grunge music was. But nu metal and that alt folk rock, I guess you could say that was a movement several years ago, which I hated that stuff, but that's a whole nother story. We're going to get into all of that with Stone from Pearl Jam in just a sec. But first, just a reminder that if you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, shame on you, then you are on my naughty list. I want you to do it right now. You can subscribe wherever you rock out to podcast. And if you're on Apple Podcast, leave a 5-star review. I appreciate all of your amazing support. And hey, don't be shy. Link up with me online. I would love to hear from you if you just want to say hey or have an idea for a guest or a topic. Hit me up on Facebook at itsmeanne.com. That's itsmeanne.com. itsmeanne.com to link up on my personal Facebook, Twitter, and Snapchat at Anne Erickson, Instagram at Erickson Anne, and support Audio Inc. Radio. Just find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Audio Inc. Radio, twitter.com/Audio Inc. Radio. That's how you can link up on all of our socials, and youtube.com/Audio Inc. Radio. That's INK like Tattoo Inc. AudioIncRadio.com. And one last thing, check out my band Upon Wings at UponWings.com. We just released, finally, a new single featuring Ralph Sheepers from Primal Fear and Gamma Ray, who sounds amazing on there. It's called Eternal Way, and I hope that you dig it.
Hi, this is Stone Gossard from Pearl Jam and Painted Shield and Loosegroove Records, and you're listening to Anne Erickson on Audio Inc. Radio.
Well, first of all, it's really great that you're releasing the debut record from the living decades after it was recorded. So tell me, why did you feel it was crucial to kind of get this music out there now?
Well, my history is in Seattle, and I witnessed and was inspired by the scene that the living helped create. And I never saw the living play live. I saw 10 Minute Warning, which was sort of the next iteration of sort of Duff McKagan's musical journey and Greg Gilmore's. And those guys were, legends in the punk rock scene and the sort of post-punk, in the sense that it wasn't just punk rock. You could tell it was like there was things about it that were taking elements from psychedelia and, hard rock and, all sorts of different sort of mixing that was kind of starting to go on, particularly in 10 Minute Warning. And I wasn't aware of the living other than I knew the name of the band, and I just assumed it was, Duff was in it, so I assumed it was cool, but I never really got to sort of hear the music. And Greg, played me some music about 2 years ago, or maybe a little bit less than that, and I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe how great it was, and how developed, and John as a singer, and the songs, and I was like, this is incredible. How did this not come out in 1982? This is better than 10 Minute Warning. This is like, these songs are like, this record would have been, enormous in Seattle, and in terms of like what people might have got excited about had it sort of seen the light of day. But things were happening fast and furious back then, so bands were forming and breaking up, and the fact that this music got to be recorded in a one-day session, and that it survived, that it never came out, and that it sounds as good as it does, it's just. And then finding out that, Duff is, the arranger and wrote the lyrics, and it makes me, I always thought Duff was always one of my heroes in terms of Seattle kind of punk rock and early kind of like, okay, there's a guy that's going out and doing it, and like, creating music, putting himself on the line, out there and playing shows, and believing in a process and a vision for what he wanted to do artistically, and and how he wanted to do it, and then to kind of hear this music and go, wow, I mean, he was so ahead of his time, and so like even better than I'd imagined it would be. I felt like an obligation. I mean, mostly an excitement of like, holy crap, this is incredible. This, I got to put this out because people are going to flip out. But also just a sense of like obligation to kind of say, hey, Duff McKagan, the story of Duff and kind of his input and impact in Seattle is not really that well known, or I don't read about it a lot. And a lot of people kind of think, well, he was in Seattle, but then went to Guns N' Roses. But his imprint, and this record I think shows it, is just like, the riffs on that living record, you can kind of hear elements of 10 Minute Warning. You can hear elements of things that I picked up and went, oh my God, I want to hear riffs like this. I want to hear, this sort of perfect balance between minor and major, and heavy and pop, and, rock and ballad, and, all of those things sort of combining. It's just, it just shows you how good he was even back then, and sort of how kind of unsung he is in regards to when people talk about Seattle, because I think he was the inspiration for a lot of folks getting up on stage and figuring out how to write songs. And so that's the rambling long answer.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I do feel like Duff, being a part of the Seattle scene, a lot of people might actually be surprised what a big part of that Seattle punk scene he was, because when you think Guns N' Roses, you kind of think of that rock and metal that was the antithesis of Seattle music and what became kind of grunge.
You know, I don't quite hear it as to me, when Guns N' Roses came out, they were refreshing in the sense that, and not necessarily every song, but I could hear elements of Seattle in there, and they were way tougher than what was going on at the time in Los Angeles. I mean, you know, It's So Easy, Mr. Brownstone, Welcome to the Jungle. All those tracks are phenomenal. I mean, they're just, incredible. So, but I love hard rock, so that's, that wasn't a leap for me. But I do think that I think Duff was the punk element in that band. I think he is the element that is making that, that toughness come through as well. So I just think it's a surprising and exciting story to tell, and the music speaks for itself. I mean, you can put it on and kind of go, this is fucking cool. It's I mean, it's like immediately you don't have to really think about it. And the songs, the arrangements of the songs, and hearing Greg Gilmore, I played with Greg and Mother Love Bone for 3 years, and just some of the best drumming I've heard him do is some of this living stuff where he's just unleashed and just so muscular, and it's so fun to be involved in helping kind of unearth this stuff and get it out to see the light of day and be able to talk about it, just because I was late in Seattle. I wasn't punk, you know what I mean? I went and saw a lot of punk shows and really was enjoying it, but I was always kind of looking for my own way into something like that, but Duff's years ahead of me in regards to sort of his connection to Seattle and his influence. I mean, he's sort of, this is important to, sort of for me just to kind of tell that story. For
right.
Sure.
Yeah, and in the press release, you mentioned that The Living was kind of ground zero for the Seattle sound, which I think is a really cool way to put it. Could you elaborate on that?
I would like to talk to Duff more about who was inspiring him at the time in terms of locally, who he was looking at that was making him go, I could do this, and who was his inspiration to say, hey, any person can get a guitar and learn a few chords and figure out a way with some friends to be in a band, and you don't have to be brilliant, and you don't have to be, you don't have to go to a university. You just have to kind of believe in yourself and believe in your bandmates and have a vision and a point of view, and let the music and the sort of the beauty of loud rock music, the way it can transport you and the way it can sort of hypnotize you, and sort of you can sort of do your own version of speaking in tongues. It just transports you, and that a lot of people in Seattle, long before me, were discovering that, and it opened the doors for a lot of people like me to kind of go, yeah, I want to do that too. That seems cool. And there was a really kind of do-it-yourself, a lot of local promoters that were sort of opening that door. Larry Reed and Hugo, whose last name is escaping me right now, the guys that ran the Showbox, they were promoting shows that were outside typical mainstream acts, and they were inspiring people in Seattle to kind of do the same. So this is one of those records that it got shelved or it got sidetracked, but it's seeing the light of day now, and it's exciting to kind of look back on it as it's a time capsule. You really get to see a really high level of artistic talent and ambition at a really interesting time in Seattle history.
The way you talk about Seattle at that time, it's very exciting and dynamic. And I almost feel like there hasn't been a huge popularized musical movement since then, since the early 90s or the late 80s and kind of that booming Seattle scene. Maybe I'm just missing something, but I feel like I don't see those musical movements anymore. Maybe it's because of the internet or something.
It's hard to say. Usually just when you think, it's never, nothing's ever going to do that again, something does. But I think there's so many revolutions in music right now, and they're so diffused that it's not as geographically sort of oriented, That would be my guess.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So tell me about the history a little bit of Loosegroove Records and kind of your mission with the label.
Well, Loosegroove is a label I started with Regan Hagar back in 1995, and it was just, sort of more sort of unbridled sort of ambition and excitement about not only creating music and wanting to keep writing songs and keep playing and playing shows, but being excited about friends bands and wanting to be connected to the process of seeing other people find that same path. So, and we did it for 6 or 7 years, and we did it sort of in our own way, and at one point we stopped, and it sort of had run its course for me emotionally. I just wasn't able to kind of wrap my head around it anymore. I just felt like I couldn't sustain it. And sort of in the process of working on some of this music that I'm involved with now with Painted Shield and some of the bands, like hearing this living record, it just sort of re-inspired me to think about wanting to do that again. And Regan and I reconnected in a way that got us both inspired to kind of you want to try it again, and meeting Billie Jean at the Orchard and having her come in as a partner and really sort of say, this is something we could do, and this is something that's that I would love to participate in. We just got re-inspired, so we're running with it.
That's awesome. Do you think that it's more difficult for artists to get noticed today, musicians to get their music out there because the market is so saturated, or do you think it's easier because it's more accessible, like anyone can put music out?
I have no idea. I honestly, in the grand scheme of objective sort of views about what is hard and difficult, it's like back before Seattle, something happened in Seattle. Nobody thought you could get a record out. You know what I mean? It's like there's always periods of times where you're like thinking nothing's gonna work, or it's hard, or it's always been hard. That journey to kind of get noticed, or to sort of succeed, or to find the right combination of people or styles or influences that kind of create something that make people excited. It's alchemy. It's magic. So I'm a believer in this, just sort of like, trust your local surroundings, that the people that you know and already are surrounded with are the very people that you can kind of connect with, and like, it's a little bit of the Wizard of Oz, where you look really familiar because it's just the same people that you were with. The Scarecrow is really just the same, the guy that was working on the farm. So I buy into that. Everything you need is kind of usually close by, and it's the kind of power of collaboration and the power of sort of finding common ground with other people that you connect with and working it out. So we haven't broken an artist yet, so we did. We kind of helped break Queens of the Stone Age, so that was a big
right.
deal
That's
for
awesome.
us, having that first Queens of the Stone Age record. But for us, it's really mostly about the excitement of working together on things. It's like The Living. I'm not expecting The Living is going to sell a bunch of records. They're going to sell some vinyl, and it's going to be great, and people are going to love it. But it's a passion project. It's just like, it's something I wake up and I think, I'm going to call Regan and we're going to talk about what we're going to do next. And then we're going to call Billie Jean and see if she says it's okay.
That's awesome. Have you thought about maybe putting out some Mother Love Bone stuff on Loosegroove that maybe hasn't been released yet, or B-side, something like that?
I don't know that there's any Mother Love Bone B-sides that haven't sort of been released at this point. I think that the Mother Love Bone box set that came out on Polygram probably had sort of most of the rarities that were sort of around. But I think looking forward and looking back are two things that I like to do. And as an old guy, I've got a lot of, connections and a lot of friends that have projects that are that I have some history with. So I think sort of doing archival stuff and doing stuff that like The Living, where it's like, oh my God, this is, if there was another kind of opportunity for records that were like The Living, in terms of like, wow, this is something really important. Loosegroove will put out some Brad music. We have some Brad music that will ultimately come out, and some Sean Smith music as well. So that will be sort of archival to a certain extent. That'll be part of our style for sure.
It's so wild to think that this release actually didn't really see a proper release back in '82. It's so crazy to think of. So it's awesome that you're putting it out.
Yeah, no, it's kind of crazy. It's almost insane, but there wasn't really a local label at that time to do stuff with. You know what I mean? Like, so, and then once it sort of hit the shelf, then Duff was off. He was doing 10 Minute Warning, and then right after that, he was down to do Guns N' Roses, and Greg was in Mother Love Bone. So it was everybody was off, and not looking back. And luckily, Greg sort of rediscovered these tapes, and it's just it's really just unbelievable that they sound so good. That's, I think, the most, because there's lots of things to unearth, but then in the end, when you listen to them, you kind of go, oh, that's pretty good, but I don't know if I'm going to put it on. But this is great.
Yeah, no, it is amazing, because you think of the technology changing the past several decades, obviously, and to still hear something from back then that sounds so good, it just sounds, it seems kind of crazy.
Yeah, and recorded on, I don't even know what format they recorded on, but it's very cool.
So seeing that bands like The Living and Mother Love Bone, they were kind of, at the beginning of the whole Seattle scene, and kind of, I don't know if I want to say smaller, but just kind of budding. Were you surprised that your next band, Pearl Jam, became such a hugely mainstream popular band?
Yeah. I mean, all of it's a surprise. I mean, you get out of high school and you start dreaming about being in bands, and all you want to do is be able to tour or sell some records. I mean, it's just so much fun, and you're like, this is, making stuff up. It's like, there's nothing more exciting than thinking that you've got everything you need in your life just by owning a guitar or drum set and having some friends, and that just by messing around on your instruments and coming up with riffs and words and artwork and scheming and dreaming about ways to present it, that you can create a life. You can create a job, or you can create some income for yourself, but you can also, like, something that gets you out of bed every day, that makes you excited about life. So, having that kind of happen for Pearl Jam, and it started in Mother Love Bone. It started right, Green River, the band Green River was sort of immediately kind of got going, and was, people were coming to see us. It was, out of the gate, things were sort of, I was being rewarded pretty quickly for just, again, messing around. So in the end, that it sort of ended up being what it's become, and sort of where it's gone, and that I get to talk about putting the Living record out on my own label at some point. That's it's all a big shock, and it's fun. It's a fun shock.
Right. I was actually talking with Greg, and he mentioned, we talked about kind of the bands back then, like Soundgarden, Nirvana. He was surprised that those bands made it so big, but he wasn't surprised about Pearl Jam, because he said he was at your first show, and that there was just something special that he could just tell, that you guys are going to be big.
That's interesting. It took me a minute to, I heard, we were listening to Soundgarden, and I mean, Nirvana to me was just like, that was the, once I started hearing sort of their records and kind of going, oh my God, because of the nature, the simplicity of Nirvana, and the directness of it, and the sort of that dynamics, the band's dynamics, and their sort of their rootedness in really blues. I mean, just so rooted in sort of in blues. And to me, they seem like, oh my God, this is slam dunk. To me, Pearl Jam was more complex. It wasn't sort of figured out yet. It wasn't like one thing. It was kind of a bunch of things kind of put together. So I wasn't sure, I wasn't sure what was going to happen.
So what's next for you the rest of the year? Do you have any other projects or any other releases coming out on Loosegroove?
Yep, a couple of releases coming out. There'll be another Painted Shield record, which we've been working on furiously over our drop boxes. I'm really excited about that. So that'll come out before the end of the year. an artist named Brittany Davis, who actually is the keyboard player in Painted Shield, but she's going to release her own solo record as well. Really excited about her. And I hope to, Regan and I hope to put together and sort of finalize a Brad record, or at least some Brad tracks that haven't been released yet too.
Awesome. What about Pearl Jam? It's funny, you guys released your record and had this great tour set up, and then it was right when everything was shutting down. It was so wild.
Yeah. Pearl Jam will definitely be back. I think we'll probably be on the road. I mean, my hope is that we start playing some shows, in the fall or early winter. I don't know what they're going to be or when they're going to be, but that's my hope. And after that, we got a lot of makeup shows to do. We've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, so you guys are still going to tour on your last album and not just jump into a new one, right?
We're always kind of recording and doing stuff, so, it wouldn't surprise me if we did some more recording, but there's no plans as of now, and I have no idea what we're going to do, but I'll be ready to go when I get the call.
Is there anything else you'd want to add? I definitely love the record, so I'm very excited for people to hear it pretty soon here.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne. I appreciate your time.
There he is, Stone Gossard of Pearl Jam. Thank you for being a great guest on my show, and it was really cool to hear just how passionate he is about getting this music from the living out there. I mean, the fact that he feels like it needs to be out there and that people are going to just love it. And I agree. I mean, it sounds so good. You would never guess that it was recorded decades ago. And it was also really fascinating to talk with him about those early Seattle days and kind of hear what he felt about Nirvana when he first heard Nirvana. Really cool that he thought, wow, this stuff could really be mainstream because it was more maybe simple or commercial, whereas Pearl Jam was a bit more complex. And he's right that there wasn't really one genre for Pearl Jam. It was a bunch of different stuff just kind of thrown into a blender, and it did come out sounding like Seattle and grunge and all of that stuff, but it was just really cool to hear that he had no idea Pearl Jam would be as big as they are. I mean, they're one of the biggest rock bands in the world, undeniably, unequivocally one of the biggest rock bands. Stone, thanks again for being a great guest, and April 16th is when The Living 1982 is out, so make sure to check that out. Wow, that was a really fun show with a fantastic guest, and I have more on the way. I'm just getting started, so don't forget to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't yet. Just search Audio Inc. Radio or search my name, Anne Erickson, wherever you rock out to podcast. Hit subscribe and you will be instantly notified of the next available episode. And be friends with me online, link up on social media. Facebook, you can find actually my Facebook at itsmeanne.com. That's itsmeanne.com. Itsmeanne.com to link up on my personal Facebook, Twitter, and Snapchat at Anne Erickson, Instagram at Erickson Anne, and you can also find us on YouTube. It's youtube.com/Audio Inc. Radio, where you'll find some exclusive stuff that is visual, where I'm interviewing bands in person, that sort of thing. So it's basically Audio Inc. TV. Check that out. And don't forget to check out my band, Upon Wings, at uponwings.com. Download our new single, Eternal Way. Stream it on Spotify, stuff like that. But if you download it, you will be my best friend. It's available on Amazon Music for download, as well as iTunes. So much great stuff on the way. I cannot wait to rock it with you all year long, and got some fun guests on the way as well that I will keep top secret, but I promise you won't be disappointed. Until next time, be safe, God bless, and we'll rock soon. Anne Erickson on Audio Inc. Radio.
It's Audio Inc. with Anne.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Audio Inc. Radio podcast. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode. Get inked online at audioinkradio.com. I'm Anne Erickson for the Audio Inc. Radio podcast.